Our next speaker is Camila Escalante. Camila is a Latin America-based Canadian reporter and the editor of Kawsachun News. Her work has focused largely on reporting on Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and currently she's in Brazil. She reports from an anti-imperialist perspective, and she is a Latin America correspondent also for Press TV. Camila co-hosts a weekly podcast featuring experts and voices from around the region called Latin America Review. So Camila, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you, Alan, and everyone else who has put time into putting this together. Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to have a look at the Canadian media. Radhika and Ellen are also in Canada, but I don't think we talk about it quite enough. Well, yesterday and today, the big news, the most important news in Latin America is that Honduras has just established ties at the diplomatic level with the People's Republic of China, breaking relations with Taiwan, and it's not looking back. And, you know, it's just to try to link this in with what we're talking about today. There's no way in which the Canadian media or the Western media is going to look at this decision, which is just yet another country of our region and of the world, to break ties with Taiwan and recognize one China. They're not going to be analyzing that. They're not going to be talking about the way in which that directly contradicts the type of information that they're pumping out every day. The pundits should be providing honest analysis of these developments as the Canadian state ramps up aggression on China in the media, and also as Ottawa does in politics. The Canadian government and its media arm, which includes but is not limited to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, but also the Toronto Star, the Sun, the Globe and Mail, CTV, and Global News, essentially disseminate and report from the same perspective. They disseminate the same information, and they are quite literally lying about the most important events in our world today as we reach the brink of nuclear war with China, and particularly on the issue of arming Nazis and extremists in Ukraine in NATO's war against Russia in Ukraine, which Canada has played a very significant role in for several years now. Right now in the news, right now in Canada, the country, at the central government is going against TikTok, just the way the United States is. It completely mirrors it. The government has made it so that federal employees, bureaucrats can no longer have TikTok on their cell phones. Obviously, everyone saw the big performance or whatever it is that took place in that congressional hearing in which the TikTok CEO in the United States testified and was questioned by congressional lawmakers. The same sort of thing is happening in Canada as well, because of course Canada doesn't have its own independent foreign policy, and it basically just mirrors everything a couple steps behind the United States. And in no way, of course, is that scrutinized or analyzed in the media in Canada. But despite that, Canada's government is trying to ban, or people within the government are trying to ban TikTok, saying that it is facilitating some sort of intelligence gathering by the Chinese state. Ottawa is continuing to advertise on TikTok. And so it's obvious that they're using these platforms for their own uses anyways. And also, nobody in the media is talking about the way in which nobody is forcing anyone to have TikTok, that these countries that are so large and powerful and have so many resources and so much development technologically in their own, Silicon Valleys, all of these Western countries could just develop their own platforms. They don't need to use these platforms whatsoever. They could easily ban it from their country the way other countries come up with their own social media platforms for their citizens to use. But it really isn't about intelligence gathering or what the Canadian government is trying to push right now, which is they're saying that it is about linked to China's election interference in the country. It really is about promoting and justifying an upcoming war with China. And so with regards to the China election interference, Trudeau's chief of staff is going to testify before a committee investigating the extent of the Chinese government interference in Canada's elections. I mean, this looks a lot like, it sounds a lot like what we heard in the United States for the past several years, or a few years back with Russiagate and the Russia fear-mongering, you know, in elections. And CSIS, the Canadian Intelligence Agency, is calling foreign interference by the Chinese government the, quote, greatest strategic threat to national security. And of course, as Danny said, the interests of, you know, the media is just serving the interests of capital. Their function is just to push war with China and justify the prolonging of the expensive NATO war against Russia and Ukraine. Also, another thing that hasn't been scrutinized, but is just absolutely, you know, shocking and I would say unacceptable as a Canadian, is that the Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada, Melanie Joly, recently commented, basically admitting that what they are seeking with this conflict and in Russia is regime change. The authorities have been extremely blatant, not only in the way in which Melanie Joly, the foreign minister, conducts herself in her so-called diplomacy, which is really warmongering around the world, around Europe, with many trips, an unprecedented sort of agenda for a foreign minister. It really is a foreign minister who just seeks to connect the dots and build consensus and find money for war. But also the former foreign minister, who's now the deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, has a very strong connection and backing by the powerful Ukrainian lobby in Canada. There's in no way has this been sufficiently scrutinized by the Canadian media. You know, the way in which this directly affects, you know, how much money we're pouring into this conflict, and you know, the way in which we are, again, prolonging war with no intention or desire to see peace negotiated. Additionally, Canada and the US and NATO are pressuring and seeking to force Latin America's support for Ukraine in opposition to the Russian special military operation. I want to talk a little bit about you know, the horrible coverage that we've seen in recent years with regards to Latin America and Canadian media. You know, right now in Canada, there have been some articles and a little bit of coverage about this report that just came out in the UN Human Rights Council regarding Nicaragua and so-called human rights. You know, this really mirrors the coverage that we saw since 2017 of Venezuela from the Canadian media, in which, you know, all of the media reports with one voice, with absolutely no perspectives from the actual people of this country, but really elevating very specific outlier views from a section of the far right US allied opposition. You know, one of the strangest examples of this, of course, was that or in general, is that they like to talk about the international community. They lie about countries being isolated, or they say they are increasingly isolated, when really Canadian and Western media has, you know, are making this claim that 40 or 50 countries in the world represent the whole of the international community. But really, these countries like Canada and the United States and Western Europe are rogue states. They're rogue regimes, and they alone, these 40, 50 countries, have voted to protect Nazism in the UN General Assembly. They have attacked, like I said, Nicaragua in the UN Human Rights Council. Again, less than a quarter of the countries of the member states of the United Nations are being considered to be the whole of the international community. And these are the same countries who in 2019 recognized a president that they themselves erected and placed in Nicaragua or in Venezuela, along with an entire government, which was really just on social media. That was Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido and his friends never had any power in Venezuela, and the media has never revised their coverage. This was in 2019. They went along in the CBC and all the major media with parallel reports about what was happening in Venezuela. And to this day, they have not revised their coverage, and there has been no accountability whatsoever on the media's position, which was just parroting this really bizarre position of Ottawa on Latin America. They literally recognized a government that didn't exist, today doesn't exist, has been completely abandoned by the United States. And this is the news we've been hearing on Latin America for the last 4 years now. The same can be said, on their coverage of Palestine, Syria, Iran, Belarus, and of course, their selective coverage of the unrest and the color revolutions that are taking place in many countries around the world. Right now, they're going to be framing what's going on in France quite differently than they would frame a very small protest taking place in a place like Nicaragua or Cuba, where they would give it a lot more airtime and make it seem as if the entire country is trying to overthrow its government. I want to talk about a particular case of the use of public media in Canada by political actors who are propagandists. The TVO is Ontario Public Television, and on TVO there is a program which is kind of like one of the main evening interview programs. It's called The Agenda. And its host is Steve Paikin. Steve Paikin is someone who has ties to the Liberal Party. One of his sons, Zach Paikin, was a Liberal Party activist, probably still is. His other son works for a senator. And this show has had, many think tanks, corporate lobbyists, but also people in general with very reactionary views. And all of this is being normalized on this platform, which is essentially Canadian state media. They also normalize Zionism. And, one of the strangest things, a lot of people have come to know this person, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was a University of Toronto professor, and he's become known now for sort of his comments on podcasts with having to do with like the culture war, always talking about these different bizarre issues, but and engaging in these issues for clicks, really. But Jordan Peterson, for many years, was one of the main experts on TVO's The Agenda. He was regularly on this program weekly, and he was pushing free market ideology, and he is blatantly anti-communist. That's actually what he's known for in Canada, in Toronto specifically, and also for pushing, men's rights activism from his university professor position. And so this is what's being normalized on Canadian public television. There's also, the issue of Canadian media to politics pipeline. These on-screen personalities are running for the major corporate imperialist parties, and they're turning up in Parliament. It's a surefire way for people to get into power. They're forming relationships, building a public profile, and finding financing to get into Ottawa or Queen's Park or City Hall. And that's mind-boggling that in the West or in the global North, this is how you get into politics, by kind of schmoozing with the corrupt people, the people who are stealing money or making money off the plundering and exploitation of other nations, these multinational mining corporations, for example. And then that's how you get into politics. It's quite different from how you get into politics in places like Bolivia or in Brazil, where you have to be a union leader, a teacher's union leader, an indigenous or campesino peasant leader, and kind of work your way up the ranks in order to enter one of the main leftist parties, and from there try to take a seat in Congress. This couldn't possibly be different. So I think people really in Canada need to look at this connection between the corporate finance parties and the media, and how they're all the same thing. So there's just nowhere to find the truth about Latin America and how imperialism operates through its conspiracies to overthrow democratically elected governments. In Canada, there's also no coverage of, like I said, the plundering of our natural resources, the bidding for contracts. And this is very relevant today, as we see everything play out in Peru after the December 7th coup, which had lots of heavy Canadian mining involvement. That's pretty much what's behind everything that took place in Peru, is these very specific interests in plundering this country and leaving it hanging to dry while taking all of the wealth out of the country with no benefit to the Peruvian people.
If you could wrap up soon, Camila.
Sure. And then I guess just to wrap up, other things that the Canadian government has been involved in that have had absolutely no coverage in the media, or adequate coverage, has been the way in which these representatives of the Canadian state have gone around trying to garner support for their war, in the Trudeau administration's big visit to CARICOM, holding all these bilateral meetings, trying to get them enlisted in the war. And of course, the involvement of Canada in the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia. The country had a central involvement, as well as these different coup and destabilization attempts in Venezuela, in Peru, and the way in which Canada, just like the United States, utilizes the OAS to further its interests in the region. And by no means is it any sort of democratic organization. None of this would appear in any sort of way in the media, nor would any voice who is capable of highlighting it be given a platform.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.